Hello. Today we're going to discuss leisure motivation. We'll first talk about just, what motivation is in general, like the general model of motivation. We'll then talk about the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. We did speak about that last time when we were looking at the unit on leisure needs. We'll be really looking at, though, specifically different variations of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, different definitions or theories, as well as specifically integrated extrinsic motivation, kind of a new term to you. And then we'll move on to looking at self-determination theory and how it relates then also to motivation. We'll then be looking at problems then with giving rewards and praise, and then looking at how we can actually foster then or increase perceived freedom and intrinsic motivation in leisure. We'll talk about some of the limitations of these theories and usefulness, and then specifically looking at kind of putting this all together related to leisure needs and leisure motivation, and how you would apply then motivation and self-determination theory in practice. So a few definitions. A motive is something that impels people to action and gives direction to that action once it is aroused or activated. So it's not something that is always existing. It has to be activated or aroused, and basically it provides direction for behavior. And then we have drives. These are more biologically based. They are physiological and like survival needs, such as hunger or thirst. And then a need is it is both physiological and socially learned motives, really. For example, we have the need for social contact, for social interaction. However, that is, as I've talked about last class, when I was talking about like the monkeys who were isolated, and some of them had died, I was talking about how socialization can be a physiological, need. However, it is also socially learned, and you can see that by, for example, all around the world, the way humans socially interact with each other is actually very different. And that's because it is both physiological, in that all humans really crave social interaction, but it is socially learned because it can be, it's culturally based. And next are expectations. So this is a motivational force underlying leisure behavior. It's what we assume is going to happen is part of the reason why we choose to do certain behaviors. We have expectations that a specific action we do will result in a certain outcome. Now, this assumes that people are very goal-directed and knowledgeable about what we actually want, but there's also tons of literature saying that humans are mostly totally, most of our behavior is subconscious, that we probably really don't realize or thoughtfully think about most of what we do, which is kind of scary to think, but perhaps true. But so this kind of theory saying that people think rationally, and we select, for example, leisure activities that are suitable to fulfill expected desires and outcomes or goals. For example, you have you want to be social, so that's a that is a motive, then you choose a social activity. Or you have the need to, I don't know, get some steam off, and move, or get in the Zen moment, and you choose to go for a run or some other physical activity. So it's assuming that we kind of logically progress through this. So this is the general model of motivation. It is, you think of your thermostat in your house. It is basically the same. We have, this is the motivational process. The basic components are, we have a need or a motive, then that leads to a specific behavior or activity, and that results in outcomes, goals, or satisfactions, and then it goes on a feedback. So, this is, kind of what your thermostat, your furnace is doing all the time. It's checking to see what the temperature is and then adjusting up or down according to, a feedback loop of what it is getting back on from the return air. Think of, we have a need to eat, for example. Well, the behavior or activity, well, it motivates you to make a sandwich. The goal or satisfaction, well, your stomach feels full and you are satisfied. So positive feedback occurs. In contrast, maybe the sandwich isn't enough, so you end up making a bowl of soup as well. A more leisure-related example is, I might have a need for social interaction. This need then activates my behavior. This activation occurs in 2 stages. First, this need for social interaction creates a disequilibrium within me. Something is not being met. So I'm going to try to reduce that disequilibrium. And then secondly, the need for social interaction is associated with a belief or expectation that certain actions will lead to reducing this disequilibrium. This is like the goal orientation. So I have a need for social interaction, and I have the belief or expectation that certain behaviors or actions will fulfill this need. So I may think that my need will be fulfilled if I go out and see a concert, on George Street, or my favorite, at the Ship. And then third, the outcome of the behavior. What type of goal or satisfaction resulted from me going to the concert? Well, the feedback happens. So feedback of the goal or satisfaction is evaluated to determine whether or not the need or motive has been fulfilled. So I've gone to the concert, and perhaps in this case, I really enjoyed talking with everyone, and I had a grand time, and I feel satisfied. So my need was met by going out to the concert. But in contrast, the opposite could occur. Negative feedback, where the behavior does not result in satisfaction of my need, and I have to, modify it or do a different behavior. So, for example, I go to the concert, I have a great time, but as everyone knows, on George Street, the music is super loud, and you don't actually ever speak to anyone. So maybe that was really part of my need. So my need is not met adequately, and I decide to modify. The next day, I phone a friend, and we go out for coffee, have a chat, and my need is met. So motivation or dispositions. These motives are really personality traits in a way. These people have a set of motives that differs from one person to the other, and we'll be talking about that more when we actually speak about personality and leisure. But for example, an extrovert, you have a great need for social interaction in new settings. In contrast, an introvert, who's really someone who's low on extroversion, but they're low sensation seeking, more familiar leisure situations. And another definition is aroused motives. These are needs that have become active. Those are called manifest needs, is another term for that. Whereas latent motives are existing needs that have become active. So next we'll talk about more in depth on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation, as we previously discussed, are rewards for participation, are seen from engaging in the activity itself. So that means that you're doing it because you for internal reasons, or, just from the pure enjoyment and love of doing that activity. In contrast is extrinsic motivation. So this is you're mostly doing the behavior because of some sort of external reward. And that, we've talked about these before: money, grades, threats of punishment, deadlines, obligations, for example. And it could be things like guilt. So there's different variations of looking at intrinsic motivation. We'll first talk about DC and Ryan's approaches to characterize intrinsic motivation. They were looking at it, so they have, 4 ways or beliefs of what intrinsic motivation really is. Okay, so this is these are really ways of really thinking about that you. To be truly intrinsically motivated, you need to have these sort of 4 characteristics. Intrinsically motivated behaviors occur in the absence of external reward. So meaning that free choice situations are important to intrinsic motivation. And I believe that's true, but, I think that you can also personally, I think that we can be a little sometimes intrinsically motivated and extrinsically. And I gave the example last time about, for example, my job. I certainly was intrinsically motivated to do it first, but, now I get paid. You wouldn't go to school for, I don't know how I went, 15 years of university or something, 13, just to, not because you love it, right? So, but they're pretty strong here, though, that it should be very much on free choice, though. Secondly, intrinsically motivated behaviors are engaged in out of interest and enjoyment. So, which totally makes sense. You're not going, if you don't truly love the activity that you're doing, you are not going, it's not going to be intrinsic to you, And, that's why, for example, we always say, why aren't people more physically active? Well, it's often because they haven't found something that is enjoyment. Leisure, experiencing leisure while you are being physically active and gaining health benefits should be the goal. And that's why we need to learn these things, so that we can help people to achieve that. If you're someone who is regularly physically active, for example, it's not difficult for you to do that. It's because you love it. Thirdly, intrinsically motivated activities are frequently optimally challenging and often result in absorbing experiences. And what does that sound like? It sounds like flow. So you can see, obviously, intrinsic motivation is very connected to the theory of flow. So again, activities where this theory is saying that really to activities that provide these absorbing, optimal, engaging experiences are the result of, you first being intrinsically motivated to do that activity. And finally, fourthly, intrinsically motivated behaviors are fostered by 3 innate psychological needs, which we learned about last class on leisure, when we're talking about needs. So we have autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And so what this is saying, that when those needs are met, when we feel autonomy, or that means choice, when we feel competence, which is, feeling the ability to do the behavior, and when we feel relatedness, meaning social connectedness to others, we then are more likely to be able to, or meeting those 3 things will allow people more to be intrinsically motivated. Vallerand and Lozier, they have, in contrast, a different view of intrinsic motivation. And they discuss 3 forms of intrinsic motivation. And this also then has application to, leisure behavior. So their theory is saying that people are motivated or intrinsically motivated, 1, toward knowledge, meaning that it is, a lot of people participate in an activity due to learning. And I'm not talking about book learning, but, learning a skill, learning, accomplishing something. The things that we are intrinsically motivated about, the things that we're truly interested in, they're also things that we often learn in and master. Secondly, we are motivated toward accomplishment. So we participate in an activity due to the pleasure in trying to reach goals and pushing our limits. I talked about that last week in a way as well when we talked about needs. It is a need of ours, again, DC and Ryan's 3 needs is competence. We, as humans, want to push ourselves and continue to grow in certain areas. And, all of us, many of us anyway, I think a lot of people have at least something that they try to, push themselves and excel at. Whether it might not be in their job they experience this, it's often in our leisure and, our hobbies. And 3, toward experiencing stimulation. So we often participate in an activity just from the sensations during the experience. Like the runner's high, or, just the adrenaline you get from doing that activity, maybe in that climb, or the swelling of sense of pride, kind of, or a sense of, kind of swells up in your heart, when you see people reacting, let's say, to the gift you gave, the scarf you crocheted, or whatever it is. That's it for me anyway. And it's nice to see others' reactions. So if even doing social things or arts and crafts can give you these experiences, or it could be relaxation could be the experience. For myself, I find, for example, crocheting like very zen, because I have to count. And some people don't count, but those people are doing like just the same stitch over and over again. So that's why they don't have to count. But if you're doing more like advanced stuff, you really need to be paying attention to what you're doing. So I find that I need to concentrate enough that it's maybe one of the only times I really find my brain is quiet. and it's because I've got to, but it's kind of meditative in that I'm doing like, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, 2 and 3, and I count like that. So even that is a stimulation. We'll now discuss the variations of extrinsic motivation, looking at the external part, and specifically discuss DC and Ryan's 5 forms of extrinsic motivation. And it's really important for you to understand the difference between all of these, because they are related to self-determination theory. So again, external motivation, or external regulation is another way of saying it, are behaviors that are controlled by external factors to the individual. And I'm going to give an example in this of a specific behavior. So I'm going to relate the example to each of these definitions of motivation and kind of show how someone would move from the one end of external up towards more of integrated motivation, which you'll understand in a moment. So external motivation, so again, things that are external. So volunteering is the example I'm going to use. So for example, often, let's say in high school, you are required to do so many volunteer hours, or I'm sure many of you, including I did this for sure, I've volunteered. Often it was like for experience, maybe I would say that, but it was also about making sure my resume looked really good when I was applying. Well, I didn't know what I was applying at the time, for a job or grad school or whatever it was. So that was, that is definitely for a reward. Next is introjected regulation. So this is when behaviors are driven by internal pressure, so inside yourself, where actions are controlled by what one feels one ought to do rather than in response to the needs of, competence, autonomy, or relatedness. So these needs then are things that are not about, self-determination. So, although these pressures are internal to the person, these behaviors are said to have an externally perceived locus of causality, is the fancy way of saying it, because the motivation is still external to the person, to their sense of self, to what is really important to them. And in this case, people often participate then in something because you feel you should, or you feel guilty. Or you participate because it makes you feel like virtuous to others, really, which isn't relatedness. So in our example of volunteering, maybe I first started to only volunteer, to pad my resume or whatever. But then I start to volunteer because I'm going to use the example of volunteering with older adults, maybe let's say visiting a long-term care. And maybe I start going, and lo and behold, I start participating past the hours that I really had to do. And I'm starting to because I feel guilty. I feel like I have to. I feel like maybe that they need me. Maybe I notice that they don't have enough volunteers. Third is identified motivation. And these are behaviors that are done because the person believes they are important or worthwhile. So note that it's because they think they're important. They're not really motivated for rewards or out of genuine interest. So, for and an example would be, I start let's say with my volunteering. So I've moved from being external, just to, pad my resume, then was to introjected, and I started to do it because I felt guilty. And now I'm in identified. And that's because in the volunteer situation, I then am starting to, it's not that I'm totally enjoying it, but I'm starting to see benefits. For example, maybe I notice my prof really likes comments I make about my volunteering with the older adults. And so I get, I can see that it's important. Or start to see other benefits besides maybe you're met a friend or something as well. And then next, people would move to integrated motivation. And this is complete internalization and integration of behavior or activity, and that it becomes part of your identity. So it is, maybe it wasn't full on intrinsic motivation, but integrated motivation is as close to intrinsic motivation as you can get. So it is when you may be doing things for some extrinsic reason, but it has still that activity or behavior has still become a massive part of your identity. So in this case, for volunteering, all of a sudden, I'm not volunteering because I have to. I'm not volunteering because of benefits that I'm seeing. I'm volunteering because it is something I'm interested in, and it's become part of who I am. I'm now, I am a volunteer. I am a volunteer at, St. Patrick's, and it might become then part of who you are and, kind of your daily life. And lastly is amotivation, which I guess should maybe perhaps gone first. I'm not sure, but it's amotivation is not really a form of extrinsic exactly. It's when intrinsic and extrinsic motivation are totally absent. I guess you would call it the blah motivation. So it's when people lack the intention to behave, likely because they either lack sense of efficacy or a sense of control with respect to the desired outcome. For example, doing an activity day after day after day without really knowing why. There could be some things, I guess, in some ways, I think in maybe like television, like watching might be a good example of that. A lot of our screen behavior is probably a motivation. You're just doing it without really knowing why. I'm not talking about social media as much because there's often rewards with that. But, especially just like watching TV, watching the Food Network, and so that's kind of an amotivated behavior. So we're talking about integrated extrinsic motivation, or this could just be called integrated motivation. So this is an important form of motivation to understand because it's a lot about how we can experience leisure in non-leisure-like activities. So it's when we have the complete internalization and integration of behavior, or activity, that it becomes part of your identity. So it is most commonly reported during leisure, when they're the least common motivations experienced in other areas of the activity, like work. So often in leisure, we experience this integrated motivation. And we can relate this then to leisure job, the Newlinger's leisure paradigm. So leisure job, if you recall, is an activity is freely chosen and is extrinsically motivated. So that's very much related then to these concepts of extrinsic motivation that DC and Ryan talk about. And this is really then leads into their theory on self-determination, which self-determination theory suggests that being able to experience intrinsic interest in externally controlled circumstances, so like external regulation, extrinsic motivation, that it involves internalization and integration. So an activity that is engaged in because of its reward can still be self-determined. This is why people can find leisure in their work, and how activities with rewards, obligations, and commitments can still be experienced really as leisure. For example, for ever since I've had children, I have not minded washing the dishes as much. And that's because I can put like a podcast on, and no one bothers you. Like no one wants to come. Like everything else you do, they're always, my children are always interrupting me. But when I'm have a washing dishes, of course, you don't get as many people coming in asking for help, and so I could actually listen to a podcast or radio program that I like and have kind of fun washing the dishes. Now, that's also where I think I try to find leisure in all tasks, like tricking myself that, the activity is fun too, but it works. So this is a self-determination theory by DC and Ryan. And you can see here that it is related to the three needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and involves all those forms of, in all the different forms of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation that we discussed. So here there is that we move through. Well, there's different forms of motivation. We could be amotivated, but it's also saying that we move from external all the way up to intrinsic, that it is possible to increase your self-determination even if you are externally motivated. And that's really the essence of behavior change. And, the more self-determined we are, the more likely we're to do an activity. And also, this is, of course, related to intrinsic motivation. So that's about enjoyment and, doing something for competence and doing something to be related. And all those things then increase intrinsic motivation and self-determination. There is a video that you can watch. I've posted it on the course shell, and it's of course there are not very many videos on self-determination theory. Go figure. Other other profs might be able to find cool videos in HQR, people exercising and such, but not on self-determination theory. But I did find one that was quite kind of simple, and you can see it's only 4 minutes, and it is some students, I think it was a class project, and it's a little hokey, but it does explain what self-determination theory is. So you could watch that. In class, I would be showing you the video. So there are self-determination really includes several mini theories. We're going to go through these theories: basic needs theory, organismic integration theory, and cognitive evaluation theory. And for any examination, you don't really need to know these in great detail, but you need to understand them in general as they're applied to self-determination theory. So basic needs theory is that intrinsically motivated behaviors are based on innate psychological needs. These are competence, self-determination, and relatedness, as well as now it might not be autonomy as much. So those are the innate psychological needs. Organismic integration theory is saying that there's a process of internalization, that individuals attempt to transform socially prescribed norms or standards into personally endorsed values or self-regulations. That's a big mouthful, but it is basically saying that people there's all these certain norms or standards that are important. And so, for example, maybe in our society, we have a standard right now, should be healthy or physically active. Or, for example, in HKR, as a student, you feel that there's a norm or standard that you should be doing lots of physical activity, because you're in HKR. So maybe, for example, you weren't physically active before you entered HKR, but then you kind of prescribe to this norm. Well, this eventually can become internalized within you, and it doesn't mean that you don't enjoy that, but it's just saying that you weren't truly intrinsically motivated to begin with. It's also about prescribing to certain values that we see in society. And so how well an individual internalizes something often depends on how well the core needs are met. And finally, self-determination theory is related to cognitive evaluation theory, which basically is a theory that explains how a person who is intrinsically motivated can become extrinsically motivated and vice versa. So, meaning you might start an activity because you totally love it, and but from participation, it can become the whole love of that sport, for example, could be sucked out by, some a bad experience, for example, and or you just eventually don't enjoy it anymore. So it can become extrinsically motivated, or the other way around can happen. You can be doing things in the beginning for extrinsic reasons, but then move more to intrinsic motivation, meaning there is hope and we can change behavior. So self-determination and leisure then are important when we have extrinsic regulation. So even if someone is extrinsically motivated, we can move them to be self-determined. And we know, though, that self-determination is highest with integrated regulation. So self-determination increases as we move from extrinsic to integrated, or then even intrinsic motivation. So that is the theory of self-determination, and we're going to discuss next time more about specifically how to apply that theory again, and a little bit more then about the danger of rewards, and then how do we foster interest, and intrinsic motivation, and how this then all relates to how do we apply this, in the field or to practice. So we'll end it there.